DBD has been out for over 7 years by now, and let me tell you, it has changed a lot. But something that I always liked is how the meta has drastically changed, surprisingly, especially for those of us that played back in 2016 and 2017. I remember perks that dominated the meta and were in every match, and nowadays nobody uses them. And in my opinion, one of the perks that fell off the hardest is self-care. This perk was absolutely everywhere back in the days, which is one of the reasons why Claudette to this day is one of the most used and iconic characters in DBD. If you started playing around 2017, every single beginner's guide recommended starting with Claudette only because of self-care. It allowed survivors to heal themselves without a medkit and without any survivor help, making it one of the most busted mechanics in the game as it saved a lot of time. Additionally, survivors didn't know how to loop as well, so being injured was a big threat. In fact, it was scary. However, the original version of self-care is busted. First of all, you used to heal yourself at 80% of base healing speed, and originally it took 12 seconds to heal instead of 16, and Sloppy Butcher or perks that give you Mangled were not as popular. Not only that, self-care also increased the efficiency of medkits by 100%, basically doubling the uses you had with them. And as an extra fun fact, originally, self-care used to stack with Will Make It, which made self-healing speeds so busted that you could heal yourself while the killer was vaulting a window. This was one of the craziest combos ever, and it was patched really quick. There was basically no downside to using self-care, and along with Sprint Burst, they were objectively the best survivor perks in the game by a far margin. Sprint Burst is still one of the best perks in the game. Meanwhile, self-care has been left to rot, as Sloppy Butcher became one of the most popular perks killer used. Medkits were heavily nerfed, self-healing speeds were reduced to only 35%, and they no longer gave medkit efficiency. From a must-use perk to a meme perk where killers say it's the 5th killer perk slot, and Boon Circle of Healing completely decimating this perk from being useful. And one of the reasons as to why self-care was so popular was simply because of the existence of Thanatophobia. This perk was a noob trap perk when it first released, reducing the speeds of all actions for each survivor that was injured, dying, or hooked. As such, a lot of survivors saw that the repair bar was red, and this gave them a placebo effect where they thought repairing generators took significantly longer, but this was not the case. Mathematically speaking, the original Thanatophobia effect was very pathetic, as it only added a small penalty for generators repaired. So the strong part of the perk was how survivors wasted their time self-caring in a corner instead of rushing generators. It was a bad perk, to the point many killer mains were giving advice to others to stop using Thanatophobia, since the debuff was so small compared to other slowdown perks that it was not worth it. But things changed when the devs decided to buff this perk significantly, removing the buff on healing speeds and instead fully focusing it on repairing, cleansing, and sabotaging. And this perk then suddenly skyrocketed in popularity, as it was an extremely easy perk to trigger, especially with the Legion and the Plague. The thing that made Thanatophobia so strong is that it made other gen regression perks even stronger, as in order to get back the progress you lost, now you have to do it on top of Thanatophobia. This perk was so easy to run and get benefits from that the devs ultimately decided to gut it to such a point where, unless all 4 survivors are injured, the slowdown effect is a measly 6%. Nowadays, this perk is only usable on Legion and Plague, and there are significantly better options to run. And since we were talking about generator slowdown, currently the most used perks in the game by far are gen regression perks like Pain Resonance, Pop Goes the Whistle, Jolt, but originally, killers didn't have the tools we have nowadays. Kicking gens was not introduced as a mechanic until patch 1.4 in February of 2017. And the worst part is that generators used to take 70 seconds to repair fully instead of 90 that we have now. So what did killers do in order to slow down the progress of the match? A lot of slugging, let me tell you. And for that reason, Deerstalker became a viable pick in the meta. All the perk did was reveal the location of slugged survivors, but originally it also had a unique feature where you could see the aura of a survivor healing the downed survivor. But this was nerfed right when the nurse was introduced in order to not make one of her perks weak. If you check any old gameplay footage of DBD, you will see how everyone is running this perk. And the funniest part is that this perk has been unchanged for 6 years, and it's been ages since I last saw someone using it. But there was also another reason as to why Deerstalker was so strong, and that is the next survivor perk. This is a well-known thing by the majority of the community, but just in case you had no idea, back in the days, survivors could sabotage both the bear traps of the trapper and the sacrifice hooks permanently. You heard me right. With just one perk called Saboteur, which had no cooldowns, you could start the match and completely eliminate one hook from the game or render the trapper powerless with 0 counters available by the killer. This was so busted that killers had to run Iron Grasp and Agitation as well as Deerstalker in order to bring survivors to the basement hooks or just bleed them on the ground, making Sabo squats a very popular tactic in the old version of DBD, and one of the reasons why the current DBD is significantly better than the mess the old version was. Sabotage plays are still common today, however, they have been relegated entirely to toolboxes or the rare archive challenges. Fun fact, the original Saboteur icon featured a bear trap, and since bear traps no longer were able to be broken, the icon changed to reflect a hook being broken instead. But after hearing about Saboteur, you might think that survivors were very broken back in the days, but this is far from the truth, as killers also had toys to play with, and my favorite build in the past was the Machinegun build, featuring Save the Best for Last and Unrelenting. And this is because both perks worked in a different way. While the first one is still a fantastic perk that got reworked, the latter used to work completely different. Instead of being a perk that reduced the penalty of missing attacks like it is nowadays, Unrelenting reduced the cooldown of your basic attacks in general, and combined with the OG Save the Best for Last, the recovery speed was so insane that it makes Trickster look slow in comparison. It was impossible to trade hooks without both survivors getting down. It was impossible to rescue from the basement. This was by far the meta for killers up until it was completely butchered 2 patches after. But the funniest part for me was the fact that Unrelenting originally used to suck, as it only reduced the cooldown of basic attacks by a pathetic 6% before it was buffed to the insane 22%. It's really sad that after the nerf, Unrelenting had no buffs whatsoever for over 6 years. And as mentioned before, tunneling used to be a huge problem in the original version of DBD. There was absolutely nothing survivors could do if the killer wanted to tunnel, and there was no reason not to tunnel either. Just like in typical behavior fashion, Bill was released with Borrowed Time, a perk that for various generations of DBD was so ingrained into the meta that it actually became a base kit perk for survivors. However, original Borrowed Time used to work differently. Back when it was first released, Borrowed Time protected both the unhooker as well as the person unhooked, but it was only done if it was inside the killer's terror radius. This made killers like Wraith, Myers, and Freddy stronger than usual, as they could bypass this perk and tunnel the survivors off the hook if they wanted to. This effect was later changed into only protecting the unhooked survivor, as it made no sense why would the unhooker get the protection. But the terror radius requirement was kept in the game until April of 2021. After that, if you were not running Borrowed Time, you were trolling. It got to the point that this perk alone dominated the way killers used to play the game, as everyone had to assume the survivors were running Borrowed Time and wait out the timer in case they wanted to tunnel. Nowadays, Borrowed Time is still a good perk that killers won't expect, as it boosts the base kit Borrowed Time survivors have, but there are just better options to combat tunneling, and it's no longer a must pick. And it's impossible to talk about tunneling without mentioning Decisive Strike, a perk that along with Borrowed Time, it completely dominated the meta not once, but twice. The first time this perk was a must pick, and honestly pay to win, was with the release of Lori Strode, as this perk worked in a completely different way. Instead of being an anti-tunnel perk, Decisive Strike was a literal get out of jail card for free that worked once per trial, stunning the killers for 5 seconds. This meant that essentially you had an extra chase for each survivor per match. The devs saw that this was extremely overpowered, so instead what they decided to do is make it so that only the Obsession can activate this perk at the start. However, if you were not the Obsession, you had to wiggle a bit before triggering Decisive. It was so insanely strong that killers learned a technique called dribbling, where they had to drop survivors on the ground and pick them up again until they got close to a hook. Decisive Strike got changed later into an anti-tunnel perk, making it still one of the best picks in the survivor meta, as it punished killers hard for tunneling, to the point that every single killer used to wait an entire minute just to not get hit by DS. Today, if the killer gets hit by Decisive Strike, it's a surprise, and the funniest part is that there are killer players pushing for a DS buff. Don't get me wrong, Decisive is still a perk that works well if you get tunneled, but just like with Borrowed Time, there are significantly better anti-tunnel perks nowadays. As new updates came out, more and more aura reading perks and tracking perks have been released, for example Lethal Pursuer or Ultimate Weapon, which by the way I made a video dedicated to it. But back in the days, the amount of aura reading perks was very lacking, as Bitter Murmur was the only choice, but it only worked in the endgame. However, what killers had is unconventional tracking perks like Spies from the Shadows and Whispers, and the latter had a huge set of fans claiming that Whispers was by far the best tracking perk in the game back in 2018. Just take a look at this killer meta tier list, where Whispers was ranked at B tier, and see the amount of comments claiming that this was low-key one of the best tracking perks in the game. I remember a lot of content creators advocating for its use, teaching the ways on how you can triangulate the perk in order to pinpoint the actual exact location of survivors. And indeed, unless you were playing with the Doctor, Whispers was a very great choice to track survivors down, especially with killers like the Pig or the Trapper. Best part of all is that this is the only perk in the entire vid that got zero changes whatsoever in terms of buffs or nerfs, and the only reason why it fell off the meta so hard is because not only is it harder to use compared to Ultimate Weapon, it simply got power crept with each new patch, as more and more killers are able to track survivors with their own power instead of relying on perks. But if you asked me what is the most insane tracking perk to be ever released, then I would not say Ultimate Weapon, not even Lethal Pursuer. In fact, it was not a killer perk, it was Object of Obsession, a perk that originally showed the aura of the killers for as long as you looked at them and you were the Obsession. This rendered a lot of characters completely obsolete, as you could do nothing in order to counter survivors running this perk besides tunneling them out of the match. If you thought Trapper was bad, you had to play as Trapper against an Object of Obsession group, since the strongest effect was by far telling your Discord friends what the killer was doing. This perk was downright frustrating to play against, since you knew from the start if any survivor was running it, and there was nothing you could do against it. No dribbling, no waiting it out, no bleeding on the ground, nothing. This is also the most controversial perk in this video, because the devs claimed that the perk was fine, since survivors running it ended up dying more than the rest, missing the entire point as to why this perk was overpowered and dominated the meta so much. Ultimately, Object has been nerfed for quite a while now, and it's a perk I rarely see when playing killer, as the shift has gone more towards distortion. And the record for the meta perk that lasted the least goes for Mettle of Man, an Ash Williams perk that completely broke the game, and I am not exaggerating. Basically, Mettle of Man gave survivors a free health state just by existing, and since self-care and medkits were still incredibly strong during this time, it basically made survivors overly strong. And the funniest part to this day is the fact that the perk didn't give the deep wound status effect like most other endurance perks. It was literally a free health state. I think the only perk that can beat the blatantly overpowered state that original Mettle of Man was is the original version of Decisive Strike, yet unlike Decisive, this perk got so gutted that it's the one with the lowest amount of pick rate by far. Still, I find it curious how ironic it is that Mettle of Man went to a perk nobody uses, and Buckle Up, one of the worst perks in the history of the game, not only became partially base kit, it's also an insane meta perk. Meanwhile, Flip Flop is stuck as a niche perk. And let's talk about another insane meta perk that lasted less than 3 weeks, and that perk is Boil Over. And what made it worse was the fact that it was not a pay to win perk, but instead it belonged to Kate, meaning that a lot of survivors had access to it. This perk has been useless for years, and it only made the wiggling effect stronger for killers, which could be easily countered, and also obscured hook auras, but as long as you had eyes it was not bad. Then suddenly, on patch 5.0.0, Behavior decided to buff this perk by a lot, adding a new effect where every time the killer fell down while carrying you, you would get a free 25% progress bonus to wiggling. This led to one of the most toxic playstyles I have ever played against, where survivors would intentionally go down in places like the RPD library stairs, which by this time were still accessible, and once they got down there was absolutely nothing you could do in order to hook them besides slugging. And this combined with Boon Exponential or with no meter made it so that survivors could stall the match almost as long as a 3-generator Skull Merchant, making the game extremely boring and with zero interaction coming from the killer side. This playstyle was so unhealthy, map dependent, and also incentivized survivor bully squads that Behavior quickly nerfed Boil Over into the perk we have today, a far cry from the buffed Boil Over we had before. And surprisingly, the next perk I want to talk about was related to a perk meta I have not heard in any video talking about it in the past, including my own meta video. Back around 2019, Spirit Fury and Enduring became one of the most used combo perk metas in the game, where instead of looping and mind gaming survivors, the killers would completely ignore pallets and not respect them until there were no pallets left. It was a very fast-paced meta that allowed killers like Leatherface, Wraith and Hillbilly to shine. However, it was very brain dead to run, and also the build didn't require anyone to purchase a DLC character as Enduring was free, and Spirit Fury belonged to Spirit, a character that console players have unlocked. This build got popular mainly because the palette generation was still somewhat broken, allowing maps to generate insanely strong loops. The best part is that this build can still be used nowadays, as essentially nothing has been changed. But since palette generation is different, this build doesn't shine as bright as before. I miss Spirit Fury, as finding out the killer was running that perk was a scary moment in game, especially against tier 3 Myers. Spirit Fury is an example of a meta that was based around trends, and in a way I think Windows of Opportunity also became a meta perk just because of trends, because the effect has been strong for quite a while. Post-editing MintSkull from the future here, and I knew my past self was forgetting something. So the reason why this combo was extremely strong in the past is because Enduring used to work with Decisive Strike, making the stun last very little, so this is mainly why. Nowadays Enduring doesn't work with Decisive Strike, but either way Decisive Strike is not a used perk, so it doesn't matter. Does anyone remember how Iron Will used to be one of the most used perks before it was completely butchered? Or so I thought, because to be completely fair, the perk still does its job, so the only reason people don't use it as much is because the perk got nerfed drastically in a different way, as it is now an exhaustion perk instead that gets disabled if you combine this with Balanced Landing, Sprint Burst or Life. What's weird is that Made for this is pretty popular, and it has a very similar requirement. However, I think the reality is that the meta is fully focused on just running and holding W, as Made for this rewards survivors for being injured. Since self-care is no longer a meta perk either, this made Iron Will not as necessary, as survivors won't try to hide or fake out the killers anymore, as pressing a button is easier. But something I noticed is that Iron Will does reduce the volume of survivors by quite a lot, so I am surprised it's not as used as it was in the past. In fact, I think out of all perks in this vid, Iron Will is the only one that I would say is underrated. However, no perk in this entire video has fallen as hard as the next one, from being mandatory in every single killer build to being complete trash. The rest of perks in this video at least have some use nowadays. Some of them, like Object of Obsession or Iron Will, are underrated, or free general perks like Deerstalker and Unrelenting that new players can use. Hex Ruin, however, in my opinion, has no salvation. Ruin was once the absolute must pick for every single killer build in the game. Back in its prime, as long as Ruin was active, it created cursed skill checks in generators, and if you hit them, it regressed the gens. It was by far the best regression perk ever, and at the same time, absolute trash. This is because Ruin fully depended on RNG. First of all, if survivors were really good, they could get great skill checks on generators, completely avoiding this perk, but if survivors sucked, they were heavily punished by it. Second of all, it was a hex perk, so if you got lucky, you could render the killer with one perk less, but if the killer got lucky, survivors wouldn't find the hex, by which point the game was honestly over. And the third worst part is that Ruin was just so good compared to the rest of perks that it made the game extremely predictable. Behavior later decided to rework the perk in order to not make it as strong as before, but then they added Undying, which brought Ruin back into the meta for a very long time, only this time worse, because Ruin worked by regressing gens automatically, and Undying basically made it so as long as that hex was in play, every time Ruin was broken, it would be replaced on another dual totem. Again, the same problem happened as before. Every single build used Ruin, and worse, this time the RNG was significantly worse because you could end up breaking 4 totems before breaking Ruin due to the way Undying worked. To think that this perk is now one of the worst, if not the worst gen regression perk, is crazy. Not only is it bad, now regression gens by 100%, which means it takes 4 seconds to regress 1 second of survivor progress, but also, for some reason, they added a feature where the perk will deactivate once someone is sacrificed. Death Hard got hit with a nerf, but it's still one of the most used perks in the game, and it's still really strong. Barbecue and Chili also got the BP bonus removed, making it no longer mandatory in each build, but it's still a top 10 overrating perk. Hex Ruin is the only perk that has been meta for 6 years, and now it's completely gutted. Anyways, let me know if you remember a perk that was absolute meta in the past, but nowadays it's rarely used. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.